Marcus Chen had always believed that the worst thing about bureaucracy was the endless paperwork. He was wrong. The worst thing about bureaucracy was when it worked perfectly, just not for the species it was supposed to serve. One misplaced decimal point in a galactic database. One overworked Centaurian clerk who confused Sol, 3 primitive designation educational monitoring only, with Sol, 3 prime candidate. Advanced Combat Academy recruitment. One quantum communication burst sent across 17 star systems to a small apartment in downtown Seattle. When Marcus opened what he thought was spam email titled, "Congratulations, you've been selected for Nexus Prime Combat Academy," he had no idea he was about to become the first human to accidentally enroll in an institution designed to train the galaxy's most lethal warriors. The galaxy's most feared academy had just gained its most unlikely student. And Marcus Chen, a 24-year-old IT support technician who got winded climbing 2 flights of stairs, was about to discover that sometimes the universe's biggest mistakes create its greatest legends. What started as a clerical error was about to become a legend that would echo across the stars for millennia. Because when humans are underestimated, when they're thrown into impossible situations with nothing but their stubborn refusal to quit, that's when the universe learns why Earth's children don't just survive, they thrive. Marcus Chen's coffee had gone cold 20 minutes ago, but he kept sipping it anyway. The bitter taste matched his mood perfectly as he stared at the endless queue of trouble tickets on his monitor. Printer won't print, computer making weird noise, internet broken everywhere except social media. The usual Monday morning disasters that somehow always became his responsibility to fix. His cubicle at Techno Solutions Inc. was a monument to mediocrity, beige walls, a dying plant that Linda from HR had guilt-tripped him into adopting, and a motivational poster featuring a kitten hanging from a tree branch with the words "Hang in there" printed in Comic Sans font. At 24, Marcus had already accepted that this was probably the pinnacle of his career ambitions. He had a computer science degree from a decent state school, enough student debt to buy a small car, and the kind of social anxiety that made ordering pizza over the phone feel like climbing Mount Everest. The email arrived at exactly 10:47 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. It didn't ping like his usual notifications, didn't slide quietly into a spam folder like the countless advertisements for miracle weight loss supplements and cryptocurrency investments. Instead, it appeared with a sound he'd never heard before, a deep, resonant chime that seemed to vibrate through his bones and make his desk lamp flicker. "Congratulations, Candidate Chen. You have been selected for immediate enrollment at Nexus Prime Combat Academy, the galaxy's most prestigious institution for advanced warrior training. Your exceptional scores in the preliminary assessments have earned you a place among this cycle's elite recruits. Prepare for immediate transport. Glory awaits." Marcus blinked at his screen, then looked around the office to see if anyone else had heard the strange sound. Janet was arguing with someone about TPS reports. Kevin was explaining why turning it off and on again really did solve most problems, and the coffee machine was making its usual dying whale sounds. Everything appeared normal, except for the impossible message glowing on his monitor. He read it again, slower this time. Galaxy's most prestigious institution, warrior training, preliminary assessments. The only assessment Marcus had taken recently was an online quiz to determine which type of sandwich best represented his personality. Apparently, he was a grilled cheese reliable, but not particularly exciting. The rational part of his mind, the part that had gotten him through 4 years of debugging code and 2 years of fixing other people's technological disasters, immediately labeled this as elaborate spam, probably some new phishing scheme designed to steal his identity, though he couldn't imagine why anyone would want to steal the identity of someone whose greatest achievement was setting up his grandmother's Netflix account. But as he moved his cursor to delete the email, more text began appearing, as if typed by invisible hands. Technical specifications scrolled past in languages he didn't recognize, star charts that looked nothing like anything he'd seen in documentaries, and biological data that seemed to be specifically about him. His height, weight, blood type, even the scar on his left knee from when he'd fallen off his bike in 3rd grade. Information that wasn't stored anywhere online. Information that no spam bot should have access to. The coffee mug slipped from his fingers, splashing lukewarm coffee across his keyboard. As the liquid seeped between the keys, the screen flickered and the email transformed. What had been plain text moments before, now displayed in 3 dimensions, holographic words floating just above his monitor. The technical specifications became rotating models of spacecraft. Star charts showed actual moving stars, and the biological data was accompanied by what looked like a real-time scan of his cardiovascular system. "This is not possible," Marcus whispered, reaching out to touch the holographic display. His fingers passed through the projected text, but he felt a tingling sensation, like mild electrical current. The email continued writing itself, and now it was providing practical information. Transportation would arrive in 72 hours. He should prepare for an extended absence, possibly several years. Personal effects should be limited to 5 kilograms. A detailed list of prohibited items followed, including primitive projectile weapons, chemical recreational substances, and emotional support animals native to Sol 3. Sol 3. That was Earth, wasn't it? Marcus had read enough science fiction to know that alien civilizations often referred to planets by their position from their star. But this couldn't actually be from aliens. That was impossible. This was some kind of augmented reality prank, maybe something Kevin from IT had set up using the company's new holographic display prototypes. He stood up abruptly, his chair rolling backward into the cubicle wall. "Kevin!" he called across the office. "Very funny, man. How did you hack my computer?" Kevin looked up from his own screen, genuinely confused. "What are you talking about?" "I've been fighting with the server all morning. Half the company's emails are bouncing." Marcus gestured at his monitor. But when he turned back, the holographic display was gone. His screen showed nothing but his usual desktop wallpaper, a picture of the Seattle skyline that came with the computer. The coffee was still splashed across his keyboard, creating small pools between the keys, but there was no sign of the impossible email. "Never mind," Marcus said quietly, sitting back down. He must be more stressed than he'd realized. Maybe he needed to take some vacation time, get more sleep, eat something other than microwave burritos for dinner. But as he reached for the paper towels to clean up the spilled coffee, his email program chimed with a normal, ordinary notification sound. A new message had arrived in his inbox from an address that looked like random characters. xt799@nexus.prime.gl. Reminder: transport arrives in 71 hours, 52 minutes, 17 seconds. Failure to appear at designated coordinates will result in immediate conscription under Emergency Protocol Zeta-7. Pack light. The galaxy is waiting. This time there were no holograms, no impossible effects, just plain text in his normal email client. But somehow that made it even more unsettling. The previous display had been so obviously impossible that he could dismiss it as stress-induced hallucination. This looked disturbingly real. Marcus spent the rest of his workday trying to focus on his normal tasks, but his mind kept drifting back to the emails. He ran every antivirus scan he could think of, checked his computer for unknown programs, even called the IT security department to report a possible breach. They found nothing. His system was clean, his network connection was normal, and there was no trace of any unusual activity. By 5 o'clock, he'd almost convinced himself it had all been some kind of stress-induced episode. Too much caffeine, too little sleep, too many years of routine crushing his spirit into dust. He was probably just having a minor breakdown, which was actually kind of reassuring in a weird way. A breakdown he could handle with therapy and maybe some meditation apps. Alien recruitment emails were significantly harder to address. He was packing up his things when his computer chimed again. Not his email this time, but every device in the office simultaneously. Every monitor, every smartphone, every tablet, even the electronic display on the coffee machine. All of them showed the same message in the same strangely formal language. "Greetings, inhabitants of Sol 3. This is a general announcement regarding candidate Marcus Chen. Employee ID 40472. Currently located at coordinates 47.6062 degrees N, 122.3321 degrees W. Standard diplomatic protocols require us to inform you that candidate Chen has been selected for mandatory service in the Galactic Defense Initiative. His contributions to universal security will be remembered with honor. Please update your records accordingly." End transmission. The messages lasted exactly 5 seconds. Then every device returned to normal. The office fell completely silent. 43 people stared at their screens, then slowly turned to look at Marcus, who was standing frozen by his cubicle with his backpack half-zipped and his mouth hanging open. "Marcus," said Janet, her voice barely above a whisper, "what the hell was that?" Before he could answer, before he could even begin to process what had just happened, every window in the building began to rattle. A low humming sound filled the air, growing steadily louder and deeper until the floor itself began to vibrate. Car alarms started going off in the parking lot. Someone's coffee cup fell off a desk and shattered. Through the large windows that faced the Seattle skyline, Marcus could see people on the streets stopping and pointing upward. He followed their gaze and felt his knees go weak. Something was descending through the clouds above the city. It was massive, easily the size of several city blocks, and it moved with the kind of impossible grace that suggested technology far beyond anything human engineers had ever dreamed of. The hull was a dark metallic color that seemed to shift and flow like liquid mercury, and it was covered in patterns of light that pulsed in complex rhythms. "Is that," Kevin said, his voice cracking, "is that a spaceship?" The craft settled into a stable hover about 1,000 feet above downtown Seattle. Smaller objects began detaching from its underside, graceful vehicles that looked like drops of liquid metal falling upward instead of down. One of them was moving directly toward their building. Marcus's email chimed one final time. The message was short. "Transport has arrived. Please proceed to the roof for immediate pickup. Do not keep the Nexus waiting." The rational part of his mind, the part that had carried him through 24 years of ordinary human existence, simply shut down. It curled up in a corner of his consciousness and refused to process any more impossible information. What was left was a weird sort of calm, the kind of artificial serenity that comes from accepting that reality has fundamentally broken and there's nothing you can do about it.
"I have to go," Marcus said to no one in particular.
"Go where?" Janet demanded. "Marcus, what's happening? What did you do?" "I don't know," he said honestly. "I got an email. I thought it was spam." The small craft had reached their building and was hovering just outside the windows. It was beautiful in an alien way, all curves and flowing lines, with what looked like transparent sections that revealed complex inner workings. As Marcus watched, a section of the hull simply dissolved, revealing an interior space that was clearly designed for passengers. "Marcus Chen," a voice said. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, resonating through the building structure itself. "You are required to report for transport immediately. Prolonged delay may necessitate the use of retrieval protocols." "What are retrieval protocols?" Marcus asked the air. In response, every piece of metal in the office paper clips, staplers, the framework of the cubicle walls, even the fillings in people's teeth began to vibrate slightly. The message was clear without being explicitly stated. Okay, Marcus said, raising his hands. "I'm coming." He walked toward the elevator in a daze, still carrying his backpack with the previous day's lunch and a book he'd never finished reading. Behind him, his coworkers were starting to panic, some pulling out their phones to call 911, others recording everything with shaky video. The alien craft outside the window adjusted its position to follow him as he moved through the building. On the roof, the wind from the hovering transport was surprisingly gentle, more like a warm breeze than the turbulence he would have expected from something that size. The dissolved section of the hull had extended itself into what looked like a walkway, solid enough to support his weight but transparent enough that he could see the city spread out below. Marcus took one last look at Seattle, at the familiar skyline he'd seen every morning for the past 2 years, at the ordinary world where the biggest crisis was usually someone forgetting their password. Then he stepped onto the alien walkway and felt it carry him into the impossible. The interior of the craft was even more bewildering than the exterior. The walls seemed to be made of the same flowing metal as the hull, but they were covered in displays showing star charts, technical readouts, and what looked like biological scans of dozens of different species. The air smelled like ozone and something faintly floral, and when Marcus breathed it in, he felt more alert and energized than he had in years. "Welcome aboard, Candidate Chen," the disembodied voice said. "Please be seated for translation to the primary transport vessel. Standard orientation materials are available for your review during transit." A chair rose from the floor, molding itself to his body as he sat down. The displays around him shifted to show what looked like an introduction video, complete with subtitles in several languages, including English. "Congratulations on your selection for Nexus Prime Combat Academy," the video began, narrated by something that looked like a cross between a butterfly and a small dragon. "You have been chosen from among billions of candidates across the galaxy to train alongside the universe's most elite warriors. Your species designation is Human, Class 7, Death World Native, Psychological Profile, Dangerously Persistent. Please prepare for an educational experience unlike any other." As the transport craft carried him upward toward the massive mothership, Marcus realized that his biggest problem wasn't figuring out how this had happened or whether he was dreaming. His biggest problem was that, despite everything, despite the impossibility and the terror and the complete upheaval of everything he thought he knew about reality, he was starting to feel excited. For the first time in his adult life, something truly interesting was happening to him. And even if it killed him, which it probably would, at least he wouldn't die wondering what might have been. The journey to Nexus Prime took 3 days, though Marcus had no real way to measure time in the featureless transit chamber where he'd been placed after leaving Earth's atmosphere. The wall showed a constant stream of what he assumed were educational materials, but most of them were in languages that looked like mathematical equations had mated with abstract art. The few that were translated into English were either completely incomprehensible technical manuals or warnings about various ways he could accidentally die during his training. His meals, if they could be called that, appeared through a slot in the wall at regular intervals. They looked like perfectly spherical portions of what might charitably be described as food, each one a different color and possessing a unique texture that ranged from uncomfortably chewy to suspiciously crunchy. The blue ones tasted like chicken, the red ones like beef. He ate them anyway, partly because he was hungry, and partly because the alternative was starvation. On the second day, he tried to engage the ship's computer in conversation, hoping to get some answers about what exactly he'd gotten himself into. The responses were polite but unhelpful. "Why was I selected?" he asked the empty air. "Candidate Chen shows optimal psychological markers for combat training," the disembodied voice replied. "Specifically, your species demonstrates unusual persistence in the face of overwhelming odds, creative problem-solving under pressure, and a disturbing tendency to form emotional attachments to projectile weapons." "I don't even own a gun," Marcus protested. "Records indicate you have completed 17 different first-person shooter video games and achieved above-average scores in simulated combat scenarios." Marcus stared at the wall display, which was now showing what appeared to be his Steam gaming profile. "Those are just games, entertainment, not actual military training. The distinction is noted, but considered irrelevant. Your species' recreational activities suggest an inherent understanding of tactical thinking and weapons application. We also play games where we're plumbers jumping on mushrooms. Does that make us qualified for plumbing or mycology?" There was a pause that lasted long enough for Marcus to wonder if he'd broken the computer. "This analogy is concerning. We will add botanical warfare to your curriculum." By the third day, Marcus had resigned himself to the fact that he was either experiencing the most elaborate hallucination in human history, or he had somehow been drafted into an alien military academy based on his Call of Duty stats. Either way, there wasn't much he could do about it except try to survive whatever was coming next. The ship finally decelerated with a sensation like being gently pressed into his chair by an invisible giant hand. The walls around him became transparent, revealing a view that made his brain struggle to process what his eyes were seeing. Nexus Prime wasn't a planet in any sense he understood. It was a construct, a massive artificial structure that seemed to be part space station, part city, and part geometric impossibility. Hexagonal sections the size of continents were arranged in patterns that folded back on themselves in ways that hurt to look at directly. Each section glowed with different colored lights, and between them, streams of what looked like liquid starlight flowed in impossible curves through empty space. "Welcome to Nexus Prime Combat Academy," the ship's voice announced as they approached what appeared to be a docking bay the size of Manhattan, established 47,000 standard years ago. Nexus Prime has trained over 2 million elite warriors from 12,847 different species. Current mortality rate during training, 23.7%. Current mortality rate for graduates in active service, 12.2%. These statistics are considered acceptable. Acceptable? Marcus squeaked. Previous mortality rates exceeded 90%. The Academy prides itself on continuous improvement in student survival. The transport settled onto a landing platform with barely a whisper of sound. Around them, Marcus could see dozens of other ships of various sizes and designs, some so alien that he couldn't even determine which end was supposed to be the front. Beings that definitely weren't human moved between the vessels, some walking, some flying, some moving in ways that violated several laws of physics. "Please disembark and proceed to Processing Center 7, the voice instructed. "Your personal effects will be forwarded to your assigned quarters. Welcome to your new life, Candidate Chen. Try not to die on the first day." The exit portal dilated open, and Marcus stepped out onto Nexus Prime for the first time. The gravity felt normal, though the air had a slight metallic taste and seemed to shimmer occasionally. The sky, if it could be called that, was a deep purple color shot through with veins of silver light that pulsed in regular patterns. He wasn't the only new arrival. A group of beings that were clearly other students were being herded toward a massive archway by what appeared to be floating robots. Marcus joined the group, trying not to stare too obviously at his fellow recruits. There was something that looked like a 7-foot-tall praying mantis wearing what might have been armor, if armor was normally made of crystals that changed color based on the wearer's mood. Next to it stood a creature that appeared to be made entirely of living shadow, occasionally solidifying into a vaguely humanoid shape before dissolving back into darkness. Behind them, A being that resembled a cross between a bear and a tree was having what sounded like an argument with itself in two different voices. And then there was the thing that made Marcus question his already fragmented grip on reality. It looked almost exactly like a human woman, about his age, with short black hair and the kind of athletic build that suggested she spent her free time bench-pressing motorcycles. She was wearing what appeared to be combat gear made from some kind of metallic fabric, and she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had never met a problem she couldn't solve by hitting it really hard. "Human?" she asked as Marcus approached, her accent suggesting she might be from somewhere in Eastern Europe. Yeah," Marcus replied. "You too?"
Natasha Volkov, formerly of Spetsnaz, currently very confused,
she said, extending a hand. Her grip felt like it could crack walnuts. "You are not military." It wasn't a question. Marcus's complete lack of military bearing was apparently obvious even to other species. Marcus Chen, formerly of IT support, currently having existential crisis. "IT support?" Natasha raised an eyebrow. "They are recruiting computer technicians now? Apparently they think playing video games counts as tactical training. In Soviet and Russian military we had saying the enemy's gate is down. This was from old science fiction book, but principle is sound. In zero-gravity combat, there is no up or down, only direction of attack." "That's from Ender's Game," Marcus said, "and that was American science fiction." "Details," Natasha waved dismissively. "Point is, sometimes video games and real combat are not so different. Although I suspect we are about to learn exactly how different they can be." Their conversation was interrupted by a sound that Marcus felt in his bones rather than heard with his ears. The floating robots that had been shepherding the new students began emitting pulses of colored light, and the crowd of alien recruits started moving toward the archway with sudden urgency. "Attention, new candidates!" a voice boomed across the landing platform, speaking in what Marcus assumed was some kind of universal translator. "You will now proceed to initial evaluation. Performance during evaluation will determine your survival prospects for the remainder of your training. Those who fail evaluation will be assigned to alternative service programs." "What kind of alternative service?" Marcus called out, but the robots were already herding them through the archway. The space beyond was enormous, a cathedral-sized chamber with walls that seemed to stretch up into infinity. The floor was covered in what looked like a cross between sand and metal shavings, and the air hummed with barely contained energy. Weapon racks lined the walls, displaying implements of destruction from across the galaxy, some recognizable as guns or blades, others defying easy categorization. Standing in the center of the chamber was a being that made all the other aliens Marcus had seen look positively mundane. It was roughly humanoid in shape, but stood at least 9 feet tall, with skin that looked like polished obsidian and eyes that glowed with inner fire. When it moved, reality seemed to bend slightly around it, as if space itself was accommodating its presence. "I am Instructor Vexai," it said, its voice carrying harmonics that made Marcus's teeth ache. "For the next 4 cycles I will be responsible for determining whether you possess the basic competencies required to survive Nexus Prime training. Most of you will fail. This is not a reflection of personal inadequacy, but rather a recognition of statistical reality." The instructor gestured toward the weapon racks. "You will select one weapon from the available options. You will then demonstrate your ability to use this weapon effectively against a series of combat scenarios. Those who show promise will advance to primary training. Those who do not will be recycled." "What does recycled mean?" asked the crystal mantis creature. "You will be broken down into component elements and repurposed as nutritional supplements for the successful candidates," Instructor Vexai replied matter-of-factly. The chamber fell silent except for the sound of what might have been nervous breathing from those species that actually breathed. "This is joke, yes?" Natasha whispered to Marcus. "I really hope so," Marcus whispered back. "You have 30 standard minutes to select and familiarize yourselves with your chosen weapons," the instructor continued. "The first scenario will commence immediately afterward. I suggest you choose wisely. Your lives depend on it." Marcus walked toward the weapon racks with the slow, deliberate steps of someone trying very hard not to panic. The selection was overwhelming. Energy weapons that crackled with contained lightning, blades that seemed to cut through the air itself, projectile weapons that looked like they could punch holes through battleships. He had no idea how to use any of them. He was reaching for what looked like it might be some kind of rifle when Natasha grabbed his arm. "Not that one," she said quietly. "See the warning symbols? That is probably antimatter containment. One mistake and we all become very pretty light show." "Then what should I pick?" Marcus asked desperately. Natasha studied the available options with a professional eye. "For you, something simple. Something that does not require years of training to avoid killing yourself. She pointed to a section of the wall that held what looked like more conventional weapons. They're kinetic projectile weapons. Point at target, pull trigger, hope for best. Marcus selected what appeared to be a cross between an assault rifle and a piece of modern art. It was surprisingly light, with a grip that molded itself to his hands and a display that automatically adjusted to show information in English. According to the readout, it fired accelerated metal fragments at moderately relativistic velocities. He decided not to ask what that meant. "Attention candidates," Instructor Vexay announced. "The first scenario will now begin. You will face a series of training constructs designed to test your combat reflexes, tactical thinking, and ability to remain functional under stress. Remember, the constructs are programmed to simulate real combat conditions. They will attempt to kill you." The floor of the chamber began to shift and reconfigure itself, rising in some places and sinking in others until it resembled a complex urban environment. Buildings grew from the metal sand, complete with windows, doorways, and what looked like defensive positions. "The scenario is simple," the instructor continued. "Enemy forces have occupied the urban center. Your objective is to reach this central command structure and eliminate the primary target. You have 20 minutes. Begin." Lights throughout the chamber shifted to a harsh red, and Marcus immediately heard the sound of weapon fire coming from the makeshift city. His fellow recruits were already moving, spreading out and advancing with varying degrees of military competence. Natasha moved like she'd been born for this, flowing from cover to cover with practiced efficiency. The crystal mantis creature leaped onto the side of a building and began scaling it with impossible speed. The shadow being simply dissolved and reappeared 50 feet ahead, already engaging what looked like robotic opponents. Marcus crouched behind what appeared to be a concrete barrier and tried to remember every war movie he'd ever seen. The problem was that war movies were terrible preparation for actual combat, even simulated combat. They never mentioned how loud everything was, how the adrenaline made your hand shake, or how difficult it was to think clearly when things were trying to kill you. A movement in his peripheral vision made him turn, and he found himself face to face with what looked like a mechanical spider. It was covered in weapon mounts and moving toward him with predatory intent. Marcus did what came naturally. He pointed his rifle in the spider's general direction and pulled the trigger. The weapon fired with a sound like thunder being compressed into a microsecond. The projectile, whatever it was, hit the mechanical spider and removed it from existence in a brief flash of light and scattered metal fragments. "Huh," Marcus said to himself. "That actually worked." The next 20 minutes passed in a blur of terror, confusion, and occasional moments of accidental competence. Marcus discovered that while he had no tactical training and no real understanding of combat, he did have two things going for him: an irrational refusal to give up, and the kind of video game experience that had taught him to treat every situation like a puzzle with a violent solution. When he encountered a group of enemies in a defensive position, he didn't try to assault them directly. Instead, he remembered a level from an old FPS game and looked for an alternate route, finding a ventilation shaft that let him bypass their position entirely. When he faced a heavily armored opponent that his weapon couldn't penetrate, he didn't try to outfight it. Instead, he led it into a trap, using the environment to collapse a wall on top of it. By the time he reached the central command structure, he was exhausted, covered in metal dust and running on pure adrenaline. The primary target turned out to be another mechanical construct, this one the size of a small building and equipped with enough firepower to level a city block. Marcus stared up at it and felt his mind go completely blank. This wasn't a video game puzzle. This was a genuine impossible situation, the kind where the only rational response was to run away screaming. But as he stood there, frozen with indecision, he heard Instructor Voxhai's voice echoing through the chamber. "Interesting. The human appears to be calculating rather than fleeing. This is unexpected." Calculating. Was that what he was doing? Marcus looked at the massive construct, at the urban environment around him, at the weapon in his hands. Maybe he was calculating, in a weird, subconscious way. His brain was processing the situation, looking for patterns, searching for solutions. The construct was big and heavily armed, but it was also slow. Its weapons were powerful, but they had limited firing arcs. The buildings around it provided cover, but they also created blind spots. Marcus started moving, not with any conscious plan, but following an instinct he hadn't known he possessed. He used the urban environment like a three-dimensional puzzle, staying in the construct's blind spots, using buildings as cover, making himself an impossible target to track. And slowly, methodically, he began to wear it down. not through direct assault, but through patience, persistence, and the kind of stubborn refusal to quit that had gotten him through 4 years of college and 2 years of technical support hell. When the construct finally collapsed, its systems overloaded from trying to track an enemy that refused to engage on its terms, Marcus found himself standing in the center of the command structure, still holding his weapon, still breathing, still alive. The urban environment dissolved back into the metal sand floor. His fellow recruits, those who had survived, stood scattered throughout the chamber. About half of the original group was still present, which Marcus realized meant the others had been recycled during the exercise. Instructor Vaxai approached him, its obsidian features unreadable. "Candidate Chen," it said, "your performance was unprecedented." "Is that good or bad?" Marcus asked. "You took 47 minutes to complete a scenario designed to be finished in 20. You used more ammunition than any candidate in Academy history. Your tactical approach can charitably be described as creative and less charitably described as insane." Marcus waited for the inevitable conclusion that he had failed. "However," the instructor continued, "you succeeded where 67% of candidates failed, including several with extensive military backgrounds. More importantly, you demonstrated the psychological resilience that is the primary indicator of survival in advanced training." "So I passed?" "You passed, Candidate Chen. Welcome to Nexus Prime Combat Academy. Try to survive your first week." As Marcus was led away to what would be his new quarters, he caught Natasha's eye. She was grinning, the kind of expression that suggested she was already looking forward to the challenges ahead. "See you in class, computer man," she called out. Marcus waved back, still not entirely sure what had just happened to his life. But for the first time since this whole impossible situation had started, he was beginning to think he might actually have a chance of surviving it. The universe's most dangerous academy had just gained its most unlikely student, and Marcus Chen was about to discover that sometimes the best way to survive impossible odds was to be too stubborn to realize they were impossible. Marcus's quarters at Nexus Prime were Spartan in a way that made his old cubicle look luxurious. The room was a perfect cube, 10 feet on each side, with walls that could display information or become transparent at will. The furniture consisted of what the Academy apparently considered a bed, a raised platform that was slightly softer than concrete, and a desk that rose from the floor when needed. The bathroom facilities were a marvel of alien engineering that he preferred not to think about too deeply. His first week at the Academy was a crash course in just how unprepared he was for everything. The daily schedule was brutal. Physical conditioning at 0500 hours, tactical theory at 0700, weapons training at 0900, combat simulations at 1100, xenobiology at 1300. Each session lasted 2 hours, with 30 minutes between classes for what the instructors generously called rest periods. The physical conditioning was led by Sergeant Krextar, a being that looked like someone had crossed a rhinoceros with a pile of boulders and then taught it to hate everything. Marcus discovered on his first day that human physical fitness standards were considered quaint by galactic military expectations. What he had thought was an exhausting workout was apparently the warm-up for the warm-up. "Human!" Sergeant Krextar bellowed during Marcus's third day of training. "You run like injured prey animal." Marcus was currently attempting something the sergeant called gravitational resistance training, which involved running on a track while wearing a harness connected to a device that could simulate the gravity of any planet in the galaxy. He was currently experiencing what it felt like to jog on a world with 3 times Earth's gravity, while carrying a 40-pound pack, while alien drill instructors shouted at him in languages that sounded like mathematical equations being put through a blender. "I'm trying," Marcus gasped, his lungs feeling like they were on fire. "Trying is for species that go extinct," Krextar replied. "You will succeed or you will become nutritional supplement." The threat of being turned into alien protein powder was apparently a standard motivational tool at Nexus Prime. Marcus was starting to understand why the Academy had such high survival rates. Anyone who didn't meet the standards got recycled, which technically removed them from the mortality statistics. Weapons training was conducted by Instructor Zeke, a being that appeared to be made entirely of living metal and had the personality of a particularly vindictive physics equation. The class took place in a massive chamber filled with every type of weapon imaginable, from simple kinetic projectile systems to devices that could apparently reshape matter at the molecular level. "Candidate Chen," Instructor Zeke said during his second week, its voice producing harmonics that made the weapons on the nearby racks vibrate slightly, "your approach to marksmanship is unorthodox." Marcus was currently attempting to hit targets with what the instructor called a plasma acceleration rifle. The weapon fired superheated gas at near light speed and required the user to account for relativistic effects, quantum uncertainty, and something called probability cascade interference. Marcus's strategy was to point it at the target and hope for the best, which was apparently not the approved methodology. "I'm hitting the targets," Marcus protested, gesturing at the training range where several target drones were now smoking wreckage. "You are hitting targets," Jake agreed. "However, you are also hitting the walls, the ceiling, 2 other students' equipment, and a maintenance drone that was not part of the exercise." Marcus looked around the range and realized that his spray and pray approach had indeed caused extensive collateral damage. Natasha, who was practicing with a weapon that fired what appeared to be miniature black holes, was giving him a look that suggested she was reconsidering her assessment of his survival chances. "The human demonstrates enthusiasm," Zeke continued, "but lacks the precision expected of a Nexus Prime graduate. Perhaps alternative weapons training would be more appropriate." Marcus found himself reassigned to a section of the armory that contained what the instructor diplomatically called specialty weapons. These turned out to be the devices that other species couldn't figure out how to use effectively, the experimental prototypes that hadn't quite worked as intended, and the weapons that were considered too dangerous or unpredictable for standard military use. It was there that Marcus discovered the M47 Adaptive Combat System, a weapon that had apparently been developed by a species that had gone extinct before anyone could figure out what they had been thinking. The M47 looked like someone had taken a standard rifle and then allowed a very creative child to redesign it using parts from a dozen different weapons. It had multiple barrels, several different ammunition feeds, and a targeting system that seemed to operate according to principles that violated causality. "That device has killed more users than enemies," Zeke warned as Marcus examined it. "Previous candidates who attempted to master it have suffered fates ranging from disintegration to temporal displacement to psychological inversion." "What's psychological inversion?" Marcus asked. "The weapon's targeting system becomes convinced that the user is the enemy and the enemy is the user. The results are typically messy." Marcus hefted the M47, surprised by how comfortable it felt in his hands. The weapon's interface immediately began displaying information in English, apparently adapting to his species and language preferences. According to the readouts, it could fire kinetic projectiles, energy beams, explosive rounds, or something called conceptual ammunition that Marcus decided not to ask about. "I think I like this one," he said. Zeke's metallic features shifted in what Marcus was learning to recognize as the alien equivalent of resigned acceptance. "Very well. The Academy medical staff has been requesting additional opportunities to practice treating exotic weapon injuries." Tactical theory was taught by Professor Vorthak, a being that looked like a cross between an octopus and a chess grandmaster. The class covered everything from small unit tactics to strategic planning on a galactic scale, and Marcus quickly discovered that human military history was considered a case study in creative desperation. The species designation for inhabitants of Sol 3 includes the notation dangerously persistent, Professor Vorthak explained during a lesson on asymmetric warfare. This is based on historical analysis of human military conflicts, which demonstrate an unusual willingness to continue fighting under circumstances that more rational species would consider hopeless. Marcus raised his hand. "Is that good or bad?" "It depends on perspective," Vorthak replied, 3 of his tentacles manipulating holographic displays while the others took notes. "From a tactical standpoint, it creates unpredictable variables that complicate strategic planning. From a practical standpoint, it means humans tend to win conflicts they should mathematically lose." The professor brought up a holographic display showing what appeared to be historical battle data. "Consider the human conflict designated World War II. By all logical analysis, the outcome should have been determined by industrial capacity and resource availability. Instead, the conflict was decided by factors such as morale, determination, and something humans call grit. Those seem like important factors," Marcus said. "They are completely unquantifiable." Vorthak's tentacles writhed in apparent frustration. "How does one calculate the tactical value of refusing to give up? How does one model the strategic impact of stubborn determination? Human military doctrine appears to be based on the assumption that impossible odds are merely challenging odds." Marcus was starting to understand why he'd been recruited, not because he was particularly skilled or intelligent, but because he belonged to a species that was apparently too stupid to know when it was beaten. The combat simulations were the most challenging part of his training. Conducted in a massive holographic chamber that could simulate any environment imaginable, these exercises pitted the students against increasingly complex scenarios designed to test their ability to function under extreme stress. Marcus's approach to these simulations was becoming legendary among the instructors, though not necessarily for good reasons. While other students applied their tactical training and followed established military doctrine, Marcus treated each scenario like a particularly complex video game puzzle. He ignored conventional wisdom, experimented with unorthodox solutions, and displayed a disturbing tendency to find ways to exploit the simulation parameters in ways the programmers hadn't intended. During one exercise, faced with a scenario where his squad was supposed to assault a heavily defended position, Marcus noticed that the simulation's physics engine treated certain materials differently than others. Instead of a frontal assault, he convinced his team to build a crude catapult using debris from the environment and launch themselves over the enemy defenses. That is not how military operations are conducted. Instructor Vexay observed after Marcus's squad completed the exercise with 0 casualties. But it worked, Marcus pointed out. That is irrelevant. Military doctrine exists for a reason.
What reason? Vexay paused.
Apparently searching for an answer to ensure predictable outcomes based on proven methodologies. But if the outcome is predictable, doesn't that make it easier for enemies to counter? Another pause. You are missing the point. What is the point? The point is, Vexay trailed off, its obsidian features displaying what Marcus was learning to recognize as confused frustration. The point is that military operations should follow established procedures. Even if different procedures work better, especially if different procedures work better, Vexay said firmly, unpredictability in military operations leads to chaos. Marcus thought about this. Isn't chaos bad for the enemy too? By his 3rd week at the academy, Marcus had developed a reputation. He wasn't the strongest student. That honor belonged to Korthal, a being that appeared to be made entirely of muscle and barely contained violence. He wasn't the smartest. Zephyra could calculate orbital mechanics in her head while composing battle hymns in 17 different languages. He wasn't even the most skilled with weapons. Natasha could field strip and reassemble any firearm in the galaxy while blindfolded and under fire. But Marcus was becoming known as the student who couldn't be broken. When faced with impossible odds, he found ways to make them merely improbable. When given scenarios designed to test his breaking point, he treated them as interesting challenges. When confronted with problems that had no solution, he invented new categories of solutions. It was driving the instructors insane. Candidate Chen, Professor Vorthak said after Marcus had somehow completed a tactical exercise by convincing the enemy AI that it was actually on his side. Your methods are highly irregular. But effective, Marcus replied. Effectiveness is not the only consideration in military operations, Vorthak said. His tentacles tying themselves in what Marcus had learned was the alien equivalent of a stress response. Reproducibility, standardization, and predictability are also important factors. Why? Because military organizations require standardized procedures to function efficiently. But what if the situation doesn't fit the standard procedures? Then you adapt the situation to fit the procedures. Marcus stared at the professor. Wouldn't it make more sense to adapt the procedures to fit the situation? Vorthak's tentacles briefly considered tying themselves into a knot. You are fundamentally misunderstanding the nature of military organization. Probably, Marcus agreed, but I'm still completing the exercises. That night, Marcus was in his quarters trying to understand his xenobiology homework. Apparently, he needed to learn the anatomical weak points of 847 different hostile species. When Natasha knocked on his door, the walls recognized her biometric signature and allowed her entry, which Marcus had discovered was the Academy's version of a doorbell. You are causing problems, she said without preamble, settling into the room's single chair. I'm just trying to pass my classes, Marcus replied. No, you are redefining what it means to pass classes, Natasha corrected. Instructors are having meetings about you. They do not understand how to grade student who succeeds by ignoring everything they teach. Marcus looked up from his studies. Are they going to kick me out? Worse, Natasha said. They are going to study you. You have become case study in human tactical thinking. They want to understand how species with no formal military doctrine can be effective in combat situations. That doesn't sound too bad, Marcus, Natasha said seriously. They want to understand you so they can figure out how to defeat humans in future conflicts. This hadn't occurred to Marcus. He'd been so focused on surviving his training that he hadn't considered the broader implications of his presence at the Academy. Nexus Prime wasn't just a school. It was a military institution that trained the galaxy's elite warriors. And those warriors might someday find themselves in conflict with Earth. What should I do, he asked. Natasha grinned, the expression transforming her face from merely intimidating to genuinely frightening. You should do exactly what you have been doing, but bigger. Bigger how? The Academy is studying you to understand human tactics, she said. But you're only one human, using tactics you learned from video games in desperation. What they really need to understand is how humans fight when they are properly trained and equipped. Marcus felt a chill of understanding. You want me to train the other humans? I want you to revolutionize how this academy thinks about warfare, Natasha replied. Show them that their standardized procedures and predictable methodologies are not the only way to win battles. Teach them that sometimes the best strategy is no strategy at all. Over the following days, Marcus began to notice other human students scattered throughout the academy. They were easy to spot once he knew what to look for. The ones who were struggling with the rigid military doctrine, who were being penalized for thinking outside the box, who were trying to apply human intuition to alien military theory. There was James Murphy, a former U.S. Marine who kept getting marked down in tactical exercises because he refused to sacrifice his squad members for strategic objectives. Sarah Kim, a former police officer who approached combat scenarios like crime scenes, looking for evidence and following leads instead of executing predetermined battle plans. Ahmed Hassan, a former engineer who treated every military problem like a design challenge, constantly asking, "What if we tried it differently?" Marcus began reaching out to them, sharing his experiences and learning from theirs. They started meeting informally during their rest periods, discussing the day's lessons and comparing notes on how to adapt human thinking to alien military doctrine. The instructors noticed, how could they not? Suddenly, human students across multiple classes were performing at levels that defied their initial assessments. They were solving problems in ways that hadn't been seen before at Nexus Prime, demonstrating tactical flexibility that challenged fundamental assumptions about military operations. During his 4th week at the academy, Marcus was summoned to meet with Commandant Tethron, the being who oversaw all academy operations. The Commandant was something that might once have been humanoid but had evolved far beyond such crude limitations. It existed partially in normal space and partially in what appeared to be a higher dimension, communicating through direct neural interface that felt like having thoughts inserted directly into your brain. Candidate Chen, the Commandant said, its presence filling the meeting chamber like contained lightning. You have become a subject of considerable interest among the faculty. I hope that's good interest, Marcus replied, trying not to think about what recycling might mean at this level of the hierarchy. Your performance suggests that human tactical thinking operates according to principles that our standard military doctrine does not address, Tethron continued. This presents both opportunities and challenges for the Academy.
What kind of opportunities?
The opportunity to understand a form of warfare that does not rely on predetermined strategies or standardized responses. The opportunity to train warriors who can adapt to any situation, regardless of how unconventional it might be. Marcus felt a growing sense of unease. And the challenges? The challenge of maintaining military discipline among students who are taught to ignore established procedures. The challenge of creating standardized training programs for inherently non-standard thinking. The challenge of preparing graduates for a galaxy where their enemies may also learn to think like humans. The Commandant's presence shifted, and Marcus felt like he was being examined by something that existed in dimensions he couldn't perceive. You will continue your current training program, Tethran decided. However, you will also begin advanced instruction in strategic planning and command theory. The galaxy needs warriors who can think like humans, but it also needs commanders who can teach others to think like humans. As Marcus left the meeting, he realized that his accidental enrollment in the galaxy's most dangerous academy was about to become even more complicated. He wasn't just learning how to be a warrior anymore. He was being groomed to become something far more dangerous, a teacher. The universe was about to learn what happened when human tactical thinking was combined with alien military technology. Marcus just hoped he would survive long enough to see the results. 3 months into his training at Nexus Prime, Marcus had stopped being surprised by the impossible. The Academy had a way of redefining reality until even the most outrageous situations seemed merely unusual. He could now field strip a plasma rifle while calculating orbital trajectories in his head. He'd learned to identify the weak points of 47 different hostile species, and he'd somehow become the informal leader of what the instructors had started calling the human contingent. The human students at Nexus Prime had grown from a scattered handful to a coordinated unit of 37 individuals, each bringing their own unique background and perspective to the Academy's rigid military structure. Marcus found himself at the center of this group not because he was the most qualified. That would probably be Sarah Kim, who had tactical experience and actual leadership training, but because he had been the first to successfully challenge the Academy's fundamental assumptions about how warfare should be conducted. The problem, Marcus explained to the group during one of their unofficial strategy sessions, is that they're trying to teach us to fight like them, but we don't think like them. They were meeting in what had become known as the Human Quarters, a section of the Academy that had been unofficially designated for the growing number of Earth recruits. The walls displayed star charts showing human space, a tiny cluster of systems that looked insignificant compared to the vast galactic civilizations represented at the Academy. Every other species here has thousands of years of military tradition, continued James Murphy, the former Marine who had become Marcus's closest ally in trying to understand the Academy's approach to warfare. They've developed standardized doctrines that work for their psychology, their physiology, their cultural background. But humans don't have standardized anything, added Sarah Kim. We've got Marine tactics, Army doctrine, Air Force strategy, Special Forces methodology, guerrilla warfare, urban combat techniques, naval operations. We've developed dozens of different approaches to fighting, and we use whichever one fits the situation. Ahmed Hassan, who had been quietly working on something at the room's central display, looked up from his calculations. I've been analyzing the combat scenarios they've been running us through, he said. They're designed to test specific skill sets according to predetermined parameters. But human military history shows that we don't work within predetermined parameters. What do you mean? Asked Marcus. Ahmed manipulated the display, showing a three-dimensional model of a recent training exercise. Look at this urban assault scenario. The intended solution involves coordinated squad movements, suppression fire, and systematic room-clearing procedures. Very methodical, very predictable. The display shifted, showing Marcus's approach to the same scenario. But you treated it like a puzzle game. You found an unused maintenance tunnel, bypassed the entire defensive perimeter, and planted explosives in the enemy command center while they were still waiting for your frontal assault. That doesn't sound very military, Marcus said. Exactly, Sarah exclaimed. That sounds like a human solving a problem. We don't have the luxury of overwhelming force or advanced technology, so we cheat. We find angles nobody else thinks of. We exploit weaknesses nobody else notices. We turn the enemy's strengths against them. James nodded thoughtfully. In Iraq, I once saw a squad take out a heavily fortified position using nothing but a stolen delivery truck, some road flares, and a lot of creative thinking. No official doctrine covered that situation, but human soldiers made it work because they adapted to the circumstances. Marcus was beginning to understand something that the Academy's instructors had been trying to quantify for months. They think warfare is a science, he said slowly. Something that can be reduced to formulas and procedures. But for humans, warfare is improvisational art, which is why they can't teach us effectively, Natasha said, speaking for the first time since the meeting had started. She had been observing the discussion with the kind of intense focus she brought to everything, evaluating the strategic implications of their growing understanding. They are trying to impose their systematic approach on species that succeeds through systematic chaos. Is that what we do? Marcus asked. Systematic chaos? Think about it, Natasha replied. Every human military victory in our history has involved doing something the enemy didn't expect. Sometimes this was technology, using crossbows against cavalry, gunpowder against swords, tanks against trenches. Sometimes it was tactics, using mobility against static defense, asymmetric warfare against conventional forces, psychological operations against superior numbers. Ahmed brought up another display, this one showing comparative analysis of human and alien military doctrines. I've been studying how other species approach warfare, he said. The Zentarians rely on overwhelming technological superiority. The Kreshtai use perfect coordination and hive mind tactics. The Vordan employ mathematical precision in their strategic planning. All of those approaches are predictable, Sarah observed. If you know how they think, you can counter their strategies. But human approaches are unpredictable because they're contextual, Marcus realized. We don't have one way of fighting. We have thousands of ways of fighting, and we pick whichever one seems most likely to work in the specific situation we're facing. The group fell silent as the implications of this understanding settled in. They weren't just students struggling to adapt to an alien military academy. They were representatives of a completely different philosophy of warfare. One that might represent a fundamental challenge to how the galaxy approached military conflict. The instructors are studying us, James said quietly. They want to understand human tactics so they can predict and counter them. But they can't, Marcus said with growing certainty. That's the whole point. If human tactics were predictable, they wouldn't be human tactics anymore. Natasha smiled, the expression suggesting she was already 3 moves ahead of everyone else in the room. So we give them what they want. We let them study us. We show them every human approach to warfare we can think of. Won't that make us vulnerable if they ever fight humans? Sarah asked.
No, Natasha replied. It will make them overconfident.
They will believe they understand human warfare because they have cataloged human techniques. But techniques are not thinking. Methods are not philosophy. Marcus was starting to see the shape of what Natasha was suggesting. You want to teach them everything about how humans fight, so they'll think they know everything about how humans think. And then, when they believe they have figured us out, we show them that human warfare is not about following patterns, Natasha concluded. It is about breaking patterns. The next few weeks saw a dramatic shift in how the human students approached their training. Instead of trying to adapt to alien military doctrine, they began demonstrating the full spectrum of human tactical thinking. They formed ad hoc units that operated according to different military traditions. One group using Marine Corps tactics, another applying Special Forces methodology. The instructors were fascinated. Here was a species that apparently had no standardized approach to military operations, yet consistently achieved results that exceeded their theoretical capabilities. Detailed studies were commissioned, tactical analysts were brought in from across the galaxy, and Marcus found himself being interviewed by xenopsychologists who were trying to understand the cognitive processes that allowed humans to function effectively without predetermined strategic frameworks. Candidate Chen, Professor Vorthak said during one of these interviews, "Your species' approach to military operations appears to violate several fundamental principles of strategic science." "Which principles?" Marcus asked. "The principle of predictable force multiplication, the principle of resource optimization, the principle of tactical standardization." Vorthak's tentacles were performing complex calculations on holographic displays as he spoke. According to established military theory, armies function effectively because their components operate according to known parameters. "That makes sense," Marcus agreed. "But human military units appear to function effectively despite having no standardized parameters," Vorthak continued. "Individual soldiers make tactical decisions based on personal judgment rather than predetermined protocols. Unit commanders adapt their strategies in real time based on changing circumstances rather than following established battle plans." "That also makes sense," Marcus said. Vorthak's tentacles briefly stopped their calculations. "But those two approaches are mutually exclusive. Either military operations require standardization for effectiveness, or they require improvisation for effectiveness. They cannot require both simultaneously." Marcus thought about this. He remembered reading about military history, about battles where rigid adherence to doctrine had led to disaster, and other battles where successful improvisation had overcome impossible odds. "What if they're not mutually exclusive?" he suggested. "What if the effectiveness comes from being able to choose between standardization and improvisation depending on what the situation requires? That would require soldiers who can instantly evaluate tactical situations, determine the optimal approach from multiple conflicting methodologies, and implement their chosen strategy without prior rehearsal or coordination," Vorthak said. "Such capabilities would be unprecedented. Or maybe they would just be human," Marcus replied. The professor's tentacles tied themselves in a knot. It was during his 4th month at the academy that Marcus received his first real test of everything he'd been learning. The exercise was announced as a comprehensive evaluation that would determine which students were ready for advanced training and which needed additional remedial instruction. Unlike the previous simulations, this one would last for a full week and would involve every aspect of their education, tactical planning, strategic thinking, leadership skills, and combat effectiveness. The scenario was complex. A multi-species rebel faction had seized control of a strategic star system, threatening to disrupt trade routes that were vital to galactic stability. The Academy students would be divided into competing units and tasked with developing comprehensive plans to retake the system. Their proposals would be evaluated by a panel of senior military officers from across the galaxy, and the winning plan would actually be implemented by real military forces. Marcus found himself appointed as the commander of Unit 7, a mixed group that included 12 human students and representatives from 6 other species. His counterpart commanders were all advanced students who had been at the academy for years, individuals with extensive military backgrounds and comprehensive training in galactic strategic doctrine. "We're going to get destroyed," James Murphy said after their first planning session. "Look at the competition. Unit 3 is commanded by Keth Var, who's been studying military strategy since before humans discovered fire. Unit 5 is led by Zarani, who commanded actual fleets during the Centauri Rebellion." Marcus studied the intelligence briefings they'd been given about the rebel-controlled system: 3 inhabited planets, 2 major space stations, a defensive fleet of nearly 100 vessels, and an estimated ground force of over 2 million combatants. The rebels had had months to prepare their defenses and were equipped with military-grade hardware obtained from sources unknown. "They expect us to develop a conventional assault plan," Marcus said slowly, "something involving fleet engagements, orbital bombardments, and systematic ground operations." "That's what military operations look like," Sarah pointed out. That's what alien military operations look like, Marcus corrected. But we're not aliens. He turned to address the entire unit, humans and non-humans alike. Every other unit is going to propose some variation of the same basic strategy. Establish space superiority, neutralize planetary defenses, deploy ground forces, secure objectives. The details will be different, but the fundamental approach will be identical. Because that is how military operations are conducted, said Veltar, a crystalline being whose species had been conducting successful military campaigns for millennia. It's how your species conducts military operations, Marcus replied. But my species has a different approach. Over the next 3 days, Unit 7 developed what Marcus privately called the most irresponsible military plan in galactic history. Instead of a conventional assault, they proposed something that violated every principle of strategic doctrine. They would infiltrate the rebel system not as an invading force, but as something much more dangerous, as refugees. The plan was audacious in its simplicity. Rather than attempting to overcome the rebels' military advantages through superior force, they would exploit the rebels' political vulnerabilities through misdirection and subversion. A small advance team would enter the system claiming to be fleeing persecution by the galactic government, seeking sanctuary with the rebel faction. Once inside the rebel infrastructure, they would begin systematically dismantling it from within. This is not warfare, Veltar protested during their planning sessions. This is espionage. This is human warfare, Natasha corrected. We use whatever works, but what about military honor, rules of engagement, the established conventions of civilized combat? Marcus looked at the crystalline being with something approaching sympathy. Veltar, humans have been fighting wars for thousands of years without any of those things. We developed military honor and rules of engagement to make warfare less horrible, not to make it more effective. But surely there are limits to acceptable tactics, Veltar insisted. There are, Sarah said. We won't target civilians, we won't use prohibited weapons, we won't commit atrocities. But within those constraints, everything else is fair game. The final element of their plan was perhaps the most controversial. Instead of attempting to defeat the rebel forces, they would convince them to surrender by demonstrating that continued resistance was futile. This would be accomplished through a series of coordinated operations designed to show the rebels that their security had been completely compromised and their cause was hopeless. When Marcus presented Unit 7's proposal to the panel of senior officers, the response was immediate and intense. Several of the evaluators appeared physically disturbed by what they were hearing. Others seemed fascinated by the unconventional approach. A few looked like they were trying to decide whether Marcus was a strategic genius or a dangerous lunatic. Candidate Chen, said Fleet Admiral Corthan, a being whose species had been conducting military operations since before most stars in the galaxy had finished forming, your proposal appears to be based on the assumption that warfare is primarily a psychological rather than physical phenomenon. We've found that convincing enemies they can't win is usually more effective than actually proving they can't win. But this approach requires extensive intelligence gathering, complex coordination, and precise timing. Admiral Corthan continued, what happens if any element of your plan fails? Marcus considered this. Then we improvise, he said simply. The room fell silent. Several of the officers began what appeared to be urgent consultations in languages Marcus didn't recognize. Finally, Admiral Corthan spoke again. The panel will deliberate and announce our decision tomorrow, he said. However, I feel compelled to note that if your plan succeeds, it will represent a fundamental shift in how the galaxy approaches strategic military operations. And if it fails, Marcus asked, if it fails, the rebel system will remain under hostile control, trade routes will be disrupted, and several million civilians will continue to suffer under rebel occupation, the Admiral replied. The consequences of failure are significant. That night, as Marcus lay in his quarters staring at the artificial sky projected on his ceiling, he realized that he was no longer just a student at an alien military academy. His accidental enrollment had evolved into something much larger. He had become a representative of human strategic thinking, a test case for whether Earth's chaotic approach to warfare could function in a galaxy governed by centuries of military tradition. Tomorrow, he would learn whether the universe was ready for the human element in galactic military operations. And regardless of the outcome, nothing would ever be quite the same again. The announcement came at dawn, delivered by Fleet Admiral Corthan himself, rather than through the usual administrative channels. Marcus and his unit were summoned to the Academy's primary briefing amphitheater, where they found themselves facing not just the evaluation panel, but representatives from military commands across the galaxy. Unit 7, Admiral Corthan began, his ancient voice carrying the weight of millennia of military experience. Your proposal has been selected for implementation. A murmur ran through the assembled officers. Several alien languages buzzed with what Marcus assumed were expressions of concern, curiosity, or possibly impending doom. However, the Admiral continued, the panel has decided that this operation requires direct oversight. You will not be sending your plan to established military units for execution. You will be implementing it yourselves. Marcus felt his stomach drop. Ourselves, sir? You and your unit will be given operational command of the resources necessary to execute your strategy, Admiral Corthan explained. This includes a modified stealth vessel, advanced intelligence gathering equipment, and a support team of specialists selected from active duty personnel. But we're students, Sarah protested. We haven't even graduated from the academy yet. You are students who have proposed a military operation that violates every established principle of strategic doctrine, the Admiral replied. If this approach is to be tested, it seems appropriate that it be tested by those who conceived it. James Murphy raised his hand. What happens if we fail? If you fail, the consequences will be significant for both the rebel-controlled system and for future human enrollment in galactic military institutions, Admiral Corthan said bluntly. Success will demonstrate that human tactical thinking represents a valuable addition to galactic military capabilities. Failure will suggest that human approaches are too unpredictable for practical military application. The weight of what they were being asked to do settled on Marcus like a lead blanket. They weren't just executing a training exercise anymore. They were conducting an actual military operation that would affect millions of lives and potentially determine Earth's future relationship with the galactic community. Sir, Marcus said, how much time do we have to prepare? You depart in 72 hours, the Admiral replied. The rebel situation is deteriorating rapidly, and conventional military solutions are proving insufficient. Your unconventional approach represents the best available option. 3 days later, Marcus found himself standing on the bridge of the GSV Shadow Step, a vessel that had been designed for missions that officially didn't exist. The ship was a marvel of engineering that bent light around itself, absorbed electromagnetic radiation instead of reflecting it, and moved through space with the subtle grace of a predator that had evolved to be undetectable. His crew was an interesting mix of academy students and experienced military personnel. The humans from his unit brought their chaotic creativity and stubborn persistence. The alien specialists contributed technical expertise and knowledge of galactic protocols. The ship's regular crew provided the professional competence necessary to keep everyone alive while they attempted something that had never been tried before. Approaching the rebel system, announced Lieutenant Zekahai, the ship's navigation officer. Sensors indicate heavy patrol activity along the outer perimeter. Marcus studied the tactical displays, watching the movement patterns of rebel vessels. According to their intelligence, the rebel fleet was maintaining a standard defensive formation based on established military doctrine. They were screening the approach routes, monitoring communication channels, and maintaining patrol schedules that followed predictable patterns. They're fighting the war they expect to fight, Marcus observed, but we're not going to give them that war. The first phase of their operation went exactly as planned, which surprised everyone, including Marcus. The Shadow Step penetrated the rebel perimeter undetected, using a combination of advanced stealth technology and timing that exploited gaps in the patrol patterns. They positioned themselves in the shadow of one of the system's outer planets, where they could monitor rebel communications without being discovered. Intelligence phase complete, reported Ahmed, who had been designated as the operation's information warfare specialist. I've identified key communication nodes, command structures, and logistical vulnerabilities. The rebels, Marcus realized, were suffering from the same limitations that affected all military organizations based on standardized doctrine. They had excellent security protocols, but those protocols were designed to counter conventional threats. They were prepared for fleet engagements, orbital bombardments, and systematic assaults. They weren't prepared for someone to simply ask politely to join them. Phase 2 begins now, Marcus announced. Sarah, you're up. Sarah Kim had spent the transit time preparing for the most unusual undercover operation in military history. She would approach the rebel system claiming to be a refugee from human space, fleeing persecution by the galactic government that had recently begun conscripting humans for military service. Her cover story was that she represented a group of human dissidents who were seeking sanctuary with the rebel faction. The beauty of the cover story was that it was essentially true. Humans were being conscripted for military service, though not quite in the way the rebels would assume, and Sarah was genuinely a refugee of sorts. She had been taken from Earth against her will to serve in an alien military academy. Using a modified shuttle that had been aged to look like a civilian vessel in distress, Sarah approached the rebel outpost broadcasting standard distress signals and requests for sanctuary. Her story was compelling. Her documentation appeared authentic, and her desperate situation fit perfectly with the rebels' narrative about galactic government oppression. "They've taken the bait," Sarah reported, over encrypted communications. "I'm being escorted to the main colony on Kepler Prime. The rebels are very interested in my claims about human military conscription." Marcus monitored Sarah's progress from the Shadow Steps command center, watching as she was processed through rebel security screenings and eventually granted temporary asylum. The rebels, he realized, were actually quite decent people who genuinely believed they were fighting against oppression and injustice. It made what he was about to do feel somewhat uncomfortable, but he reminded himself that their plan would ultimately result in fewer casualties than a conventional military assault.
Phase 3, Marcus announced.
"James, you're up." James Murphy's role was perhaps the most audacious part of their plan. While Sarah established their human refugee cover story, James would approach the rebel system from a different direction, claiming to be a deserter from the galactic military who had inside information about upcoming assault plans. His job was to convince the rebels that they were about to face a massive conventional attack, prompting them to reorganize their defenses according to standard military doctrine. The psychological element of their operation was crucial. By feeding the rebels accurate but misleading information, they could manipulate the rebel leadership into making tactical decisions that would actually weaken their defensive position. The rebels would prepare for the war they expected to fight, leaving them vulnerable to the war that was actually coming. "Contact established," James reported. "The rebels are very interested in my intelligence about fleet movements and assault timetables. They're repositioning their defensive assets according to my recommendations." Marcus watched the tactical displays as rebel ships moved into new formations, following standard defensive doctrines that were designed to counter conventional attacks. The rebels were competent, professional, and making all the right decisions based on the information they had been given. Unfortunately for them, the information had been carefully crafted to lead them into a tactical trap. "Phase 4, Marcus said. "This is where it gets interesting." The next phase of their operation involves something that had never been attempted in galactic military history: a coordinated information warfare campaign designed to convince an entire star system that resistance was futile. Using the intelligence Ahmed had gathered about rebel communication networks, they began systematically demonstrating that their security had been completely compromised. Rebel commanders found encrypted messages in their personal communication accounts. Supply officers discovered that their inventory systems had been altered. Security personnel realized that their patrol schedules had been accessed and modified. Nothing destructive, nothing harmful. Just clear evidence that their most secure systems had been penetrated by an enemy that could strike anywhere at any time. "Psychological pressure increasing," reported Natasha, who was monitoring rebel communications for signs of growing paranoia and demoralization. "Internal security investigations are disrupting normal operations. Command authority is being questioned." The genius of their approach was that it created a feedback loop of increasing suspicion and decreasing effectiveness. The more the rebels investigated the security breaches, the more evidence they found that their systems had been compromised. The more evidence they found, the more they restricted access to sensitive information, which reduced their operational efficiency and created additional opportunities for psychological manipulation. "They're starting to suspect each other," Natasha observed. "Internal communications show growing distrust between different rebel factions." Marcus felt a twinge of guilt as he watched the rebel organization begin to tear itself apart. These people weren't evil. They were idealists who believed they were fighting for freedom and justice, but they were also occupying a strategic star system and threatening the stability of interstellar commerce, which affected billions of innocent civilians throughout the galaxy. "Phase 5, Marcus announced. "Time for the final push." The last phase of their operation was the most ambitious. They would offer the rebels a way out that preserved their dignity while removing them as a strategic threat. Using Sarah's established cover as a human refugee and James's position as a supposed military deserter, they would propose a negotiated settlement that gave the rebels most of what they wanted, while returning control of the star system to the galactic government. The key was framing the negotiation as a face-saving compromise rather than a surrender. The rebels would be offered autonomous governance of their colonies in exchange for opening the trade routes and accepting galactic oversight of space traffic. It wasn't everything they wanted, but it was more than they would get if they continued fighting against increasingly impossible odds. "The rebel leadership is considering our proposal," Sarah reported from her position within the rebel hierarchy. "They're war-weary, paranoid about security breaches, and facing internal dissension. The negotiated settlement looks attractive compared to the alternatives." Marcus watched the tactical displays as rebel military formations began to stand down. Individual ships were powering down their weapons systems, defensive installations were reducing their alert levels, and ground forces were consolidating into defensive positions rather than aggressive deployments.
They're going to accept, James confirmed.
The Rebel Council is voting on the compromise proposal. Preliminary counts suggest approval by a significant majority. 3 weeks after entering the Rebel system, Marcus received the communication he had been hoping for. The Rebel leadership was formally accepting the negotiated settlement. The strategic star system would remain under nominal Rebel control, but space traffic would be allowed to resume, trade routes would reopen, and the threat to galactic commerce would be eliminated. Operation successful, Marcus reported to Admiral Corthan. Rebel military threat neutralized through negotiated settlement. No casualties on either side. Trade routes restored to full operation. The response from Nexus Prime was immediate and intense. Fleet commanders from across the galaxy requested detailed briefings on the operation. Military analysts demanded comprehensive reports on human tactical methodologies. Strategic planners began incorporating unpredictability factors into their operational models. Candidate Chen, Admiral Corthan said during Marcus's debriefing, "Your operation has achieved results that conventional military doctrine suggested were impossible. You neutralized a significant strategic threat without firing a shot, eliminated enemy resistance without engaging enemy forces, and restored regional stability while preserving the dignity of all parties involved." "It seemed like the most efficient approach, sir," Marcus replied. "Efficient," the Admiral repeated thoughtfully. Yes, I suppose that is one way to describe it. Tell me, how did you know your approach would work?" Marcus considered the question. "I didn't, sir, but I knew that conventional approaches weren't working. And unconventional problems sometimes require unconventional solutions. And if your approach had failed, then we would have tried something else, sir. That's what humans do. We adapt to whatever situation we're facing." Admiral Corthan was quiet for a long moment, his ancient features displaying what Marcus had learned to recognize as deep contemplation. "The galaxy has been conducting warfare according to established principles for thousands of years," he finally said. "Battles are won through superior force, advanced technology, or tactical advantage. But you won a conflict by convincing your enemies that fighting was unnecessary." "With respect, sir, that's how most human conflicts end," Marcus replied. "We fight until one side decides the cost of continuing isn't worth the potential benefit of winning." "That suggests that human warfare is fundamentally different from galactic warfare," the Admiral observed. "Maybe, sir. Or maybe galactic warfare just hasn't encountered human thinking before." 6 months later, Marcus graduated from Nexus Prime Combat Academy with distinctions in tactical innovation, strategic planning, and psychological operations. His classmates included humans from Earth, aliens from across the galaxy, and a growing number of mixed species units that were learning to combine different tactical approaches into new forms of military doctrine. The human element had officially been added to galactic military curriculum. Students were now required to study adaptive tactical thinking, improvised strategic planning, and what the instructors had started calling constructive unpredictability. The rigid doctrines that had governed galactic warfare for millennia were being supplemented by approaches that emphasized flexibility, creativity, and the kind of stubborn persistence that refused to accept that any situation was truly hopeless. Marcus was offered positions with military commands throughout the galaxy, opportunities to apply human tactical thinking to conflicts that had been considered unsolvable. But he chose instead to return to Earth, where he found a world that had changed dramatically during his absence. The success of human students at Nexus Prime had attracted attention from galactic governments, military organizations, and commercial enterprises. Earth was no longer an isolated backwater planet, but a recognized source of innovative military thinking and adaptive strategic planning. Human military advisors were in demand across the galaxy, and Earth's defense forces were being upgraded with advanced alien technology. "So what's next?" asked Natasha, who had accepted a position training mixed species units for the Galactic Defense Initiative. They were meeting at a cafe in downtown Seattle, not far from the office building where Marcus's impossible adventure had begun. "I've been thinking about that," Marcus replied, looking out at the Seattle skyline where alien ships now move routinely among human aircraft. The galaxy spent thousands of years developing standardized approaches to warfare. Maybe it's time someone developed standardized approaches to peace.
Peace?
Natasha raised an eyebrow. "That sounds more difficult than war, probably," Marcus agreed. "But that's never stopped humans before." Above them, a ship that looked like liquid starlight was descending toward the Seattle spaceport, carrying passengers from worlds whose names Marcus was just beginning to learn. The impossible had become routine. The galaxy had discovered the human element, and Marcus Chen, former IT support technician, accidental military genius, and living proof that sometimes the universe's biggest mistakes create its greatest legends, was ready for whatever came next. After all, he was human. And humans, as the galaxy was learning, specialized in turning impossible odds into interesting challenges. The administrative mistake that had introduced a human to the universe's most dangerous academy had become something much more significant, the first chapter in a new era of galactic military history. And Marcus Chen, who had started this journey as the most unlikely student in the galaxy, had become exactly what the universe needed. A teacher who could show others that sometimes the best way to win was to change the rules of the game entirely. The legend had begun, and legends, as humans had always known, were just the starting point for even greater stories.